Racist cop kicks black pregnant lady, but he's shocked to find out who her husband is. Maya's heart raced as the squad car's flashing blue lights illuminated the dusky road ahead. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white with tension, while her other hand instinctively rested on her rounded belly. 5 months pregnant, she couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Not now, not ever. Her breaths came shallow and quick as she pulled over to the side of the road. The pavement seemed eerily quiet, devoid of passing cars or pedestrians. It felt as if the world had conspired to leave her utterly alone at this moment. The officer emerged from the police car, his figure casting a long shadow as he approached her vehicle. The crunch of his boots against the gravel echoed ominously in the still air. Maya's pulse quickened as she lowered her window, trying to remember the advice her husband Jordan, a civil rights attorney, always gave her. Stay calm, be polite, and never make sudden movements. License and registration, the officer barked. His voice was cold, devoid of the professionalism she'd expected. Yes, officer, Maya replied softly, her voice trembling as she reached for her purse. Her movements were deliberate and careful. She handed over the documents, her hands shaking slightly. Did I do something wrong? The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, his piercing gaze swept over her, narrowing when he noticed her swollen belly. Step out of the vehicle, he demanded abruptly. Maya froze. Officer, is something wrong? She asked, her tone wavering between fear and confusion. I'm pregnant. I'm not sure it's safe for me to. Step out of the car, he interrupted, his voice rising, a menacing edge creeping into his tone. His hand hovered near his baton, and Maya's stomach churned with dread. The cold, detached authority in his eyes told her all she needed to know. This wasn't about a traffic violation. Reluctantly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. As she stepped onto the gravel, her legs felt weak beneath her, but she stood tall, one hand protectively cradling her belly. Please, officer, she pleaded, trying to keep her voice steady. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just trying to get home to my husband. The officer's lip curled into a sneer. I'll decide what's wrong, he snapped, moving closer. What are you hiding? Maya's heart pounded in her chest. Hiding, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not hiding anything. Before she could finish her sentence, the officer's voice boomed, cutting her off. Get on the ground. Her eyes widened in disbelief. I can't, she stammered, her hand trembling as she gestured to her stomach. I'm pregnant. Please, you have to understand. But understanding was nowhere to be found in his cold, unyielding gaze. He stepped closer, his presence looming over her like a storm cloud. I said get on the ground, he roared, his hand now gripping his baton. Fear gripped Maya as tears welled in her eyes. Her mind raced with thoughts of her husband, her unborn child, and the countless stories she'd heard of situations like this spiraling out of control. She couldn't let that happen. She had to survive this, for her baby. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone in her pocket. Don't move, the officer barked, his baton raised. I'm calling my husband, Maya said, her voice cracking. He'll explain everything. The officer's sneer deepened, but Maya's fingers moved instinctively. She dialed Jordan's number and pressed the phone to her ear, praying he would answer. The line rang once, twice, and then his familiar, calm voice filled her ear. Maya? What's wrong? Jordan, she gasped, struggling to keep her voice steady. I've been pulled over and the officer. He's being aggressive. I'm scared. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and then Jordan's tone shifted, sharp, commanding, the voice of a man who had spent years fighting injustice. Where are you? Maya rattled off her location as quickly as she could, her words tumbling over each other in her haste. The officer loomed closer, his baton still raised, his jaw tight with irritation. Stay calm, Maya. I'm coming. Don't hang up, Jordan said firmly. Maya clung to his voice like a lifeline as the officer barked more commands, his tone dripping with contempt. She could feel the weight of his authority pressing down on her, but Jordan's voice in her ear reminded her she wasn't alone. Help was coming. She just had to hold on a little longer. Maya Johnson had always been cautious, careful to avoid unnecessary attention. Growing up as a black woman in a predominantly white neighborhood, she learned early on that she had to navigate the world differently. She knew the rules were not the same for everyone, and she had adjusted her life accordingly. But no amount of preparation could shield her from the vulnerability she felt now, 5 months pregnant, standing on the side of a lonely road with a police officer's stern gaze locked on her. Her husband, Jordan, had warned her countless times about encounters with law enforcement. As a prominent civil rights attorney, Jordan had spent his career fighting systemic racism and police brutality. He'd seen the worst of what could happen in situations like this. Over their dinner table, he would recount harrowing cases of black families torn apart by an act of unnecessary violence. "Always be polite, comply, and don't escalate," he'd say, his voice tinged with worry. "But if anything feels wrong, call me immediately. I'll handle it." Maya had always taken his advice to heart. She was careful to follow traffic rules, mindful of her speed, and ensured her car was in perfect working condition. On the day of her doctor's appointment, she had left early to avoid rushing and had driven cautiously on her way back home. She thought about the ultrasound images in her purse, the tiny heartbeat she and Jordan had been so thrilled to see earlier that day. This was supposed to be a joyful time in her life, a period of anticipation and preparation for their first child. Instead, she now found herself in a nightmare. The officer who had stopped her, Officer Jenkins, was not unfamiliar to the community. He had a reputation for being overly aggressive and unreasonably suspicious, particularly toward black residents. Maya had seen his face before, in town hall meetings, in community forums where neighbors shared their uneasy experiences with law enforcement. Jordan had even mentioned Jenkins in passing once, describing him as trouble waiting to happen. When Jenkins had pulled up behind her with his flashing lights, Maya's first thought was confusion. She hadn't been speeding or violating any laws. Still, her heart sank as she pulled over, the reality of the situation settling in. She was alone, with no witnesses and no support. The deserted road felt like an extension of the officer's authority, cold, unyielding, and isolating. As Jenkins approached her car, Maya's instincts told her to stay calm. She repeated Jordan's advice in her mind like a mantra: be polite, comply, don't escalate. But from the moment Jenkins' cold gaze met hers, Maya could sense his hostility. The way he dismissed her explanations, the accusatory tone in his voice, it was clear he wasn't interested in understanding. His demands grew harsher, and his demeanor more threatening. It wasn't about the law, it was about power. Maya's thoughts kept circling back to her baby. Every choice she made now wasn't just about her. She had to protect the small, vulnerable life growing inside her. She felt the baby's subtle movements, a quiet reminder of what was at stake. Her fear wasn't just for herself, but for the child who might be harmed if this situation spiraled further out of control. The weight of her vulnerability hit her like a tidal wave. Maya was acutely aware of her position. A black woman, visibly pregnant, alone on a deserted road with an officer who seemed intent on asserting his dominance. She thought about Jordan and how he would react when he found out. He had always fought to shield her from moments like this, from the grim reality of the systemic issues he dedicated his life to combating. But now, that reality was hers to face. At that moment, Maya wished she had ignored her impulse to take the scenic route home. She wished for the safety of their house, the warmth of Jordan's voice, and the security of knowing she was far from danger. But it was too late. She was here, in this moment, with no choice but to navigate the perilous terrain of a police encounter. As Jenkins barked his commands, his tone laced with contempt, Maya's fear gave way to a quiet resolve. She thought of the countless women before her who had faced similar encounters and the strength they must have summoned to endure them. She thought of her baby and the future she wanted to give them, a future where they wouldn't have to live in fear. It was this resolve that led her to call Jordan, her lifeline in a moment that felt like it could determine everything. Maya knew she couldn't control Officer Jenkins' actions, but she could control her own. She was determined to stay calm, to protect herself and her child, and to ensure she survived this encounter. For Maya, survival wasn't just about her own life. It was about the life she was carrying, the life she and Jordan had fought so hard to create. Officer Jenkins loomed over Maya, his imposing frame blocking out the last traces of daylight. His face was a mask of irritation, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though it might snap. Maya's trembling hands stayed at her sides, her mind spinning as she calculated every word and movement, knowing that one wrong action could ignite his simmering anger into something far more dangerous. "What are you hiding?" Jenkins demanded, his voice low and threatening. His eyes darted to her car, narrowing suspiciously as though he expected to find something incriminating in plain sight. Maya swallowed hard. "I'm not hiding anything, sir," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm just trying to get home." "Don't lie to me," he snapped, taking another step closer. The intimidation was palpable, his sheer proximity suffocating. "You people always think you can get away with something." The word stung. You people. Maya had heard them before, but never in a moment where her safety was so precarious. Her heart pounded as she forced herself to stay composed. "Please, officer," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm 5 months pregnant." I didn't ask for your excuses," Jenkins interrupted, his voice rising. His hand hovered near the baton on his belt, a silent warning that made Maya's blood run cold. "Get on the ground. Now." Tears welled in her eyes as she glanced down at her swollen belly. The idea of kneeling, of being forced to the ground, was both physically and emotionally unbearable. "I can't," she whispered. "Please, you have to understand." Jenkins' patience evaporated in an instant. His hand flew to his baton, gripping it tightly as he took another menacing step forward. "Don't make me tell you again," he growled. "Get down before I make you." Panic surged through Maya as she tried to steady her breathing. Her survival instincts were screaming at her to comply, but the fear of harming her baby kept her frozen in place. I just need to call my husband," she said, her voice trembling as she reached into her pocket. The move was slow and deliberate, her hand inching toward her phone with every ounce of care she could muster. "What the hell are you doing?" Jenkins barked, his baton snapping free from its holster. "Put your hands where I can see them." Maya froze, her fingers inches from her phone. Tears streamed down her face as she slowly raised her hands. I need to call my husband." "Please." "Your husband?" Jenkins sneered, his tone mocking. "What's he going to do? Talk me out of arresting you?" Maya's chest tightened, and a sob escaped her lips. "I haven't done anything wrong," she whispered. "I just need help." Jenkins stepped closer, towering over her. "You think being pregnant gives you a free pass? That I'll just let you go?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "That's not how this works." Maya's legs threatened to give out beneath her as the weight of her fear became too much to bear. She glanced desperately at her phone, praying she'd have a chance to make the call before things escalated further. Just then, her phone buzzed in her pocket. The sound seemed deafening in the tense silence that hung between them. Jenkins' eyes flicked to her pocket, his lips curling into a snarl. "Hand it over," he demanded, holding out his free hand. Maya hesitated, torn between her fear of defying him and her need to reach out to Jordan. Her trembling hand slowly retrieved the phone and placed it in his outstretched palm. Jenkins snatched it from her, glancing at the screen. Jordan's name was displayed on the caller ID. His jaw tightened as he rejected the call and shoved the phone into his pocket. "You won't be needing this," he said coldly. Maya's heart sank as she realized how truly isolated she was. The only lifeline she had to safety was now gone, and she was at the mercy of a man who had already decided she was guilty of something. Anything. "Please," she said again, her voice barely audible. "I just want to go home." "You'll go home when I'm done with you," Jenkins replied, his tone sharp and final. He gestured with his baton toward the ground. "Get down. Now." Before Maya could comply, the sound of tires screeching on the pavement shattered the tense silence. Both she and Jenkins turned to see a black SUV skidding to a halt behind the police cruiser. The driver's door flung open, and Jordan stepped out, his face a mask of controlled fury. "What the hell is going on here?" Jordan demanded, striding toward them with purpose. His suit jacket flared open, revealing the badge of his profession. An attorney who had fought battles like this countless times before. Jenkins' posture stiffened as he turned to face the newcomer. "Step back," he ordered, his voice losing a fraction of its earlier confidence. Jordan ignored him, his eyes locking on Maya. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softening as he approached her. Maya nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. He took my phone," she said, her voice cracking. "He told me to get on the ground." Jordan's jaw clenched as he turned his attention back to Jenkins. "You have no right to treat her like this," he said, his voice steady but laced with barely contained rage. "She's done nothing wrong." Jenkins straightened his shoulders, trying to regain his authority. "Sir, I'll ask you to step back. This is police business." Jordan didn't flinch. "And I'm making it my business," he said sharply. "You don't get to harass my wife. Now hand over her phone." Jenkins hesitated, his grip tightening on the baton. He glanced toward the road as another car slowed, its occupants pulling out their phones to record the unfolding scene. The weight of scrutiny began to press down on him, and for the first time, his confidence wavered. Reluctantly, Jenkins reached into his pocket and retrieved Maya's phone. He thrust it toward Jordan with a scowl. "Take it," he said curtly. "But this isn't over." Jordan took the phone and handed it back to Maya before stepping protectively in front of her. "You're right," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "It isn't over. I'll see you in court." The weight of his words hung in the air as Jenkins took a step back, his bluster fading in the face of mounting witnesses and Jordan's unyielding presence. For the first time, the balance of power began to shift. As the confrontation reached its peak, Maya clung to Jordan's arm, feeling the tension radiating through him. The air was charged, thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Officer Jenkins shifted uneasily on his feet, the presence of onlookers and the unwavering authority in Jordan's tone breaking down the shield of power he had relied on moments earlier. Jordan turned his head slightly toward Maya, his voice soft but steady. "Are you sure you're okay?" She nodded, though her knees still trembled beneath her. I think so." "The baby is," her voice faltered, but Jordan squeezed her hand gently, grounding her. "Let's get you checked out just to be sure," he said firmly, his eyes darting back to Jenkins. By now, several cars had pulled over, their occupants stepping out to record the scene on their phones. The hum of murmured voices created a chorus of public scrutiny that Jenkins could no longer ignore. His eyes darted from the crowd to Jordan, who stood between him and Maya like an immovable wall. "Sir," Jenkins began, his voice attempting to reclaim the authority that had slipped from his grasp. "You need to step back. This is still inactive." Jordan cut him off with a sharp glare. "No, Officer Jenkins, what this is a gross abuse of power. You had no reason to pull her over, no justification to intimidate her, and no right to escalate this situation to the point of violence." His voice rose slightly, enough to ensure the onlookers heard every word. "And now, you've made a mistake that you're not going to walk away from." Jenkins opened his mouth to argue, but stopped short as another car pulled up. This one wasn't a passerby. It was an unmarked black SUV with tinted windows. The passenger door opened, and a tall, commanding man stepped out. He was dressed in a sharp suit, and his badge gleamed in the low evening light. "Chief Wilson," Jenkins muttered under his breath, the confidence draining from his face entirely. The police chief's eyes swept over the scene, his expression grim. He took in Maya's trembling form, Jordan's protective stance, and the gathering crowd. Without a word, he approached them, his presence alone enough to quiet the murmurs of the onlookers. "What's going on here?" Chief Wilson's voice was calm, but carried an undeniable authority that commanded immediate answers. Jordan wasted no time. "This officer pulled my pregnant wife over without cause," he began, his tone measured but seething. He escalated the situation unnecessarily, demanded she get on the ground, and confiscated her phone when she tried to call for help. "I arrived just in time to prevent it from getting worse." Wilson's jaw tightened as he turned to Jenkins, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Is that true?" Jenkins stammered, "Chief, I was conducting a routine." "Enough," Wilson snapped, cutting him off. "I've already received multiple calls about this stop. And from what I see here, routine is the last word I'd use. He turned to Maya, his tone softening. Ma'am, are you all right? Maya nodded, but her voice was faint. I just want to go home, she said, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. Wilson gave her a reassuring nod before addressing the crowd. Thank you for being here, but I'll need everyone to step back so we can handle this properly. His tone left no room for argument, and while many onlookers continued recording, they complied, giving the scene more space. Turning back to Jenkins, Wilson's expression darkened. Hand over your badge and weapon. Now. Jenkins' face blanched. Chief, Now? Wilson barked, the command echoing in the tense air. With shaking hands, Jenkins unhooked his badge and gun, handing them over without further protest. Jordan stood silently, his arms still wrapped protectively around Maya as he watched Jenkins' authority crumble. It was a small measure of justice, but he knew it was only the beginning. Mr. Lewis, Wilson said, turning to Jordan, his tone professional. I want to assure you this matter will be investigated thoroughly. Officer Jenkins will face the full consequences of his actions. But for now, I suggest you take your wife home and ensure she receives any medical attention she needs. Jordan gave a curt nod. That's exactly what I intend to do. But you can expect to hear from me very soon, Chief. Wilson didn't flinch. Understood. As Jordan helped Maya back into their car, the tension in the air began to dissipate. The crowd started to disperse, though murmurs of indignation lingered. The faint glow of phone screens continued to light the darkening street as people reviewed the footage they had captured, evidence of what had unfolded. In the car, Maya's hands shook as she rested them on her lap. Jordan reached over and held one of them tightly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a soothing rhythm. You did everything right, he said softly, his voice filled with both pride and sadness. I'm so sorry this happened. Maya nodded, her eyes welling with tears. I was so scared, she whispered. I thought something might happen to the baby. Jordan's jaw tightened as he fought back his tears. I know, he said, but we're going to make sure Jenkins pays for what he did. Not just for us, but for everyone he's hurt. Over the next few days, the video of the incident spread like wildfire across social media and news outlets. Public outrage grew, with people demanding accountability not only for Jenkins, but for the systemic failures that allowed officers like him to operate unchecked. Protests formed outside the police station, and community leaders called for widespread reform. Maya and Jordan became the faces of a movement, their story resonating with countless others who had faced similar injustices. Jordan worked tirelessly to build a legal case, not just against Jenkins but against the department that had fostered an environment of impunity. Maya, though still shaken, found strength in sharing her experience, knowing it could spark change. Weeks later, Jenkins was officially charged with misconduct and assault. The police department announced new initiatives to address racial bias and excessive use of force, though Jordan remained skeptical of how effective they would be. Still, it was a step in the right direction. In the quiet moments at home, Jordan and Maya found solace in each other. They knew the fight for justice was far from over, but they also knew they weren't alone. Their community had rallied behind them, and their story had become a catalyst for change. One evening, as Maya rested on the couch, her hand gently cradling her belly, she felt a strong kick from the baby. She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes as she looked at Jordan. Our baby's strong, she said softly. Jordan knelt beside her, placing his hand over hers. Just like their mother, he replied, his voice full of love and admiration. Together, they prepared for the battles ahead, knowing they were fighting not just for themselves but for a better future, for their child and for everyone who deserved to live without fear. The weeks that followed the encounter with Officer Jenkins brought waves of change and reflection for Maya and Jordan. The media storm surrounding the incident had transformed their lives in ways they never anticipated. They were no longer just a couple preparing to welcome their first child. They had become symbols of resilience and justice in a society grappling with deep-seated issues of systemic racism and abuse of power. Maya sat in the nursery one quiet afternoon, folding tiny baby clothes and placing them into the drawers Jordan had assembled just a week earlier. The pastel walls were painted with clouds, a serene backdrop that stood in stark contrast to the turmoil they had faced. Her hand instinctively rested on her belly, feeling the gentle movements of the life growing inside her. She closed her eyes and exhaled deeply, letting the calm of the room soothe her. The baby's strength was a constant reminder of her own. Despite the fear and humiliation she had endured, she had survived, not just for herself, but for her child. The thought alone had kept her going through moments of doubt and exhaustion. Downstairs, Jordan was on a call with one of the community leaders spearheading police reform initiatives sparked by their case. His voice carried through the house, firm and impassioned. He spoke of accountability, of systemic change, and of a future where no one else would have to endure what his wife had. For Jordan, the fight had only intensified. The lawsuit against Officer Jenkins and the police department was proceeding, and it had drawn national attention. Civil rights organizations had reached out, offering their support, and Jordan's inbox was flooded with messages from people who shared their own stories of injustice. He knew the weight of their expectations, but he welcomed it. This was the battle he was born to fight, and now it was deeply personal. Later that evening, they sat together on the couch, Maya leaning against Jordan as the glow of the television bathed the room. A news report was airing, highlighting the protests and policy changes that had come in the wake of their story. Maya watched as footage of their press conference played, her voice steady but filled with emotion as she spoke about the importance of justice and protecting the vulnerable. "It still feels surreal," she said softly, turning to Jordan. "All of this. It's so much bigger than us now." Jordan nodded, his arm draped around her shoulders. "It is. But that's what makes it matter. This isn't just about what happened to you, Maya. It's about what happens every day to people who don't have the chance to speak out. We're making sure they're heard." Maya smiled faintly, though tears welled in her eyes. "I just want our child to grow up in a world where they don't have to be afraid, where they're seen for who they are, not judged for what they look like." Jordan leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "That's what we're fighting for. And we're not alone." As the months passed, their story became a rallying point for conversations about justice and equality. The local police department implemented mandatory de-escalation training and introduced an independent oversight committee to review misconduct cases. Jenkins faced both legal and professional consequences, and his case became a precedent for accountability within the force. But for Maya and Jordan, the most profound changes were personal. They found strength in each other and their growing community of supporters. The letters they received from strangers across the country, sharing their gratitude and solidarity, became a source of hope during difficult days. Each message reminded them that their voices, though initially born of pain, had sparked something transformative. One crisp autumn morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, Maya felt the first signs that it was time. Hours later, their daughter, Ava, was born. Holding her in their arms, they felt a profound sense of purpose. Ava's arrival was a reminder of why they had endured the struggle and why they would continue to fight for a better world. As they brought Ava home, they stood for a moment in the doorway of her nursery, the clouds on the walls seeming to glow with the promise of brighter days. Jordan wrapped his arm around Maya and kissed the top of her head. "She's our reason," he whispered. Maya nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She's our future." As they settled into their new life as a family, they carried with them the knowledge that their fight for justice had created ripples far beyond what they could have imagined. Ava would grow up knowing her parents had stood against injustice, and she would inherit a world that, while still imperfect, was beginning to change because of their courage. In the end, Maya and Jordan's story wasn't just about one encounter or one fight. It was about resilience, love, and the unwavering belief that a better world was possible. And as they watched their daughter sleep peacefully that night, they knew their journey was far from over. But for now, they found peace in each other and in the knowledge that they were building a brighter future, one step at a time.